We're going to get started. Thanks for coming. I realize I never introduced myself, and it's likely that not all of you know me. My name's Kyle Miller. I'm an assistant professor here. My task tonight is to introduce the guest speaker, Gena Wirth. And I'm going to read a little bit of this before I speak more freely. Gena Wirth is a designer, urban planner, and horticulturalist. As project manager and now associate at SCAPE, although I should have edited this because I just learned she's now design principal. Is that correct? 3 promotions in 1 year. Something good is happening. She pulls from her interdisciplinary training to create ecologically rich and culturally relevant landscapes from the infrastructural scale to the site level. Gena was on the original Oyster-tecture team and was the project manager for SCAPE's involvement in the Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency, the initiative in New York City to make the coastal protection measures more robust in preparation for future superstorms. Gena also managed SCAPE's winning Rebuild by Design proposal called Living Breakwaters, a climate change resiliency strategy for the South Shore of Staten Island. Developed in tandem with an interdisciplinary team of architects, engineers, marine biologists, and educators, the project was selected for implementation funding by the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the spring of 2014. Gena holds a Master of Landscape Architecture degree and Master of Urban Planning degree with distinction from Harvard's GSD, and a Bachelor of Science in Horticulture from the University of Delaware. More recently, our school has called on Gena on multiple occasions. In the fall, when I got to know Gena more, she was a resource team member during our 4-day Mayor's Institute on City Design conference. I think that's what it was called. An invaluable resource team member bringing her expertise in landscape and planning to the discussion. And then currently, Gena is a visiting critic, leading a studio focused on what she calls constructing a new landscape identity for Syracuse University. So generally, Gena and her students are looking at how the medium of landscape has the potential to become a generator of urban organization, using our campus as an experimental site. So I imagine that theme, as it's populating many of the student projects, will populate some of the work today. Please join me in welcoming Gena Wirth.
Thank you very much. I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to present tonight, but I'm also equally appreciative of the opportunity to be teaching here this semester. It's been a really wonderful experience, and I'm very, very excited about the kind of next couple weeks within my studio, and I'm very excited to be here tonight to kind of share some of our work with you. So I'm Gena from SCAPE Studio. I've entitled this lecture Next Century Infrastructure, which sounds like a very big picture and kind of projective title. It's how we, SCAPE, as an office, kind of think about our design work, whether it's very, very small projects or very, very large projects, and that our work is truly kind of designing for the future, and really designing between these systems of landscape, urban nature, and often, and more increasingly so, engineering. So I wanted to kind of frame the lecture this evening about how landscape architecture and how design is really becoming a field that's not only about thinking about specific spaces, but thinking about the kind of systems that inform those spaces and designing processes around those spaces for their future development. So I put my kind of contact information up here for you. I'm really hoping that this can be a lecture, but it can also be more of a conversation that will extend into the future. And I wanted to also start with a really kind of quick introduction to SCAPE. We're a small landscape practice located in Lower Manhattan. We really kind of thrive on collaborative design, both within the office, but also outside of the office. So we try to invite kind of interesting design partners into our projects, but also kind of unconventional project partners into our office work. And I'll speak on that this evening. A lot of our work really operates kind of at this moment of where we are, right? We're thinking about kind of building landscapes for the present day, but these landscapes are very dramatically influenced by actions and trends of the past. The places we inhabit today are shaped by the actions of the past, and really need to anticipate the actions of the future. So we might exist within a kind of certain slice of time, but we try to design landscapes and think about systems that are can anticipate future change. So we know that we're in a world of kind of temperature change, of climate change, of sea level rise, of potentially storm intensity change, of kind of urban population shift and growth, and our work tries to anticipate that across a whole variety of scales. And so I thought I would speak tonight on kind of three major projects, kind of speaking the most time on this concept of living breakwaters. It's a project I've been working on really intensively throughout a number of stages over the last year. But really these three projects really embrace that idea of kind of designer-led infrastructure and designer-led systems thinking at different scales and different kinds of projects and proposals. So the first project is a project that's really about identifying landscape systems, coming to a place and kind of understanding what's happening through a mapping and a revealing of landscape systems. And that's a book project called Petrochemical America. The second project is really kind of a more projective project, a proposal on how to rethink those systems. We have certain systems which are kind of everywhere in our urban landscape. In this case of Town Branch Commons, kind of urban systems of water management have been designed and engineered in one particular way, and we're trying to rethink how that happens within a city and the city fabric. And then finally, the third project is really thinking about how to design totally new systems that are nature-based and kind of respond to naturally occurring systems, but are man-made, projected, and adaptable within the future. And so this project is living breakwaters. So these three things kind of scale up in approach, scale up in kind of style of thinking, and scale up in terms of actual physical scale and proposal. So connecting the dots, kind of beginning to understand a landscape. This is how we begin all of our projects, with site analysis, right? Many of you begin your projects in the same way. And this is a project that kind of stays in that phase and really delves deeply into a place. And so this is a book proposal, and it was produced by the Office of SCAPE. The book itself is authored by Kate Orff, who is the partner and founder of SCAPE, and Richard Misrak, who is an accomplished landscape photographer, very well exhibited, very kind of iconic landscape photographer. And we were introduced to this project in a really interesting way. We're just generally interested in beautiful, evocative, interesting landscapes, and this is a book about it's a book about the country, but it's also a book about southern Louisiana, which has really powerful, evocative, immersive landscapes, as this image really articulates. And Richard actually came to our office and introduced us to this place. He had traveled in southern Louisiana about a decade ago and taken a whole series of images, really powerful, very large format images that he had never published. He had never turned into a true body of work. And he was interested in going back after this decade had elapsed, re-looking at this landscape, trying to understand what had changed about it, but also bringing in a design partner to help kind of connect the dots, to help tie the story of this landscape and this place to a larger story about how it came to be. And so what this landscape is it's southern Louisiana. This is New Orleans. This is Baton Rouge here. And so this is the Mississippi River that connects the two. You look at this image and it looks like a landscape that's really dramatically impacted by water and the flow of water, and also by agriculture. You see the kind of French arpent system of parcelization along the Mississippi that form the plantations that are kind of so much of the culture and identity of this place. But you also see what a watery landscape it is, in that there's a lot Lake Pontchartrain and other kind of large bayous and lake systems that ring this landscape. This is a swamp landscape. But what it also is it's an industrial landscape. And this is why Richard was here photographing a decade ago, because of this industrial landscape and the juxtapositions and the impacts of that industrial landscape on its people and on its ecosystems. And so this landscape is kind of more classically known as River Road, which is the kind of the number of plantation homes that line this space, kind of very prominent tourist attractions within this area. It's a kind of iconic River Road space. It's also known as the industrial corridor because there are a huge number of petrochemical facilities located along the river here. It's kind of a highway for petrochemicals within our country. And it's also sometimes known as Cancer Alley, which is a much more kind of inflammatory term, in that there are really extreme juxtapositions in kind of health concerns in the proximity of large industries and small kind of disadvantaged populations within this area. And so it's very hard to prove kind of correlation between chemical contamination and health risks, but it is definitely an area where some of those kind of conditions are very clear and apparent. So it's a landscape that can be interpreted in multiple ways. And we came to this project by looking at Richard's images and became kind of enamored with the place and also deeply depressed by the conditions that existed. So this is not necessarily an optimistic project to work on, but it's a very important project within our office. So this is one of his images of kind of chemical tankers, the kind of full-on industrial landscape that takes up much of this space. Some extreme juxtapositions in land use. This is a cemetery in front of I believe, an ethylene refinery. But what's happened here is a kind of legacy of time in that there used to be a town in the background here that had a cemetery. The town was ultimately slowly displaced by the expansion of this facility, and only the cemetery remains kind of surrounded by large industrial fabric. The landscape is kind of populated by places that seem very pastoral, with, again, what look like very extreme juxtapositions and maybe natural and urban. But really that's not the case here. This is an image that's entirely a kind of artifact of mankind and a product of petrochemical production. So there's a processing facility in the background, but the foreground, this agricultural landscape of sugarcane production, is also a petrochemical landscape in that it's fed by fertilizers, herbicides, fungicides that are direct products of the oil that's extracted off the Gulf of Mexico, refined at these facilities, and turned into these actual fertilizer and herbicide materials. So this is a landscape that's actually highly dependent upon those same kind of chemical production cycles. Same with this image. This is the image that Richard calls the Norco chemical cloud. And it looks, again, like a very kind of pastoral, rural scene. And in the background is the Norco facility, the New Orleans Refining Company, which is actually the name of the town. It really kind of shows how deeply linked these industries and these places are. But this cloud is a kind of cloud that kind of constantly hovers over the facility, and it's formed by some of the condensate that comes from that facility. And then there's landscapes that have just been very dramatically altered and impacted by the much larger scale kind of manipulations of land and water that have happened at the scale of the river within southern Louisiana. So this is Alligator Bayou, and it's a space that's been impacted. It's a kind of dying cypress marsh, cypress swamp that has been really impacted by the changes of the levee system, by the changes of the water dynamics, and the kind of canalization that has happened in much of southern Louisiana. So Richard really began to catalog this, and he shared these images with us, and we were kind of hooked, and we said, we want to do a project with you, we want to collaborate. We also just want to understand more about this place. So we traveled down to southern Louisiana and began to look around these spaces, and really realized that this is not a kind of place that could be solved by a kind of 2-month design intervention or kind of question. It was a much bigger question, and really was a space that kind of articulated a number of issues that really shape our kind of direction forward as kind of a country. So there are a lot of kind of extreme problems here, and problems that we felt needed further investigation and kind of a deeper look. But these were problems that were kind of expressed in a landscape that were really driven by kind of national patterns of consumption and kind of national scale policy decisions. So we were very interested in kind of connecting those dots and really beginning to kind of map out the systems of what led to this landscape and how did this come to be. So this is kind of a project that's about looking back. And we looked back for a long time. And we really thought about how to map these cycles that were at play here, these cycles that ultimately have been very destructive cycles upon this landscape. So these are both cycles of kind of oil production and kind of extraction out of a landscape, an economy based upon extraction, a kind of landscape in place based upon a concept of waste, which is purely offloading waste as opposed to integrating it into a productive cycle, and then a landscape that has really dramatic impacts on ecology and food systems. So we felt there were a number of kind of very negative cycles that were in place here, and with the work of the book, we really tried to identify some of these cycles draw connections, kind of connect the dots between many of the operations which may appear discrete, but try to understand how they're really interrelated. And so again, this landscape, which looks like it's a landscape very much formed by water, is now a landscape that's really very much formed by extraction and petrochemical production, essentially. So this is a map of all the petrochemical facilities located along River Road. So every small, dark dot is a petrochemical facility. They're all linked to the river because they're all fed by the river, and that barges and tankers, it's a highway for these facilities. And then these words, these are all the words of the actual products that are refined and created in this space. So oil, natural gas, petroleum products come in from the Gulf, where they're pulled out of the ground miles below the seafloor, and they're brought to these places and they're turned into this huge array of chemical products. We call this image the chemical cloud. And then the book itself is kind of organized around these different systems, these different kind of destructive cycles at play within this landscape. And I don't have time tonight to kind of dive into all of them, but I wanted to give you a glimpse of our chapter on infrastructure, which really looks at the interdependencies between the kind of natural infrastructure of southern Louisiana, its marshlands, its geology, its salt deposits, and the kind of man-made infrastructure that has landed on top of that, extracted pieces of that, kind of taken ownership over some of that natural infrastructure and integrated into its business model. And so every kind of chapter has a kind of orienting drawing that shows how many of Richard's images kind of feed into this larger scale mapping story, and his images kind of reappear in our drawings throughout the book to kind of make the link between what you're seeing in these huge immersive views and what's happening within other parts of the region, the country, and the world. And so this section on infrastructure really looks at the pipeline. The pipeline is a kind of single marker of the flow of material, the flow of a natural resource, like natural gas or ethylene or oil. And we map it kind of extending from offshore over the levee system into the refining facilities, into moments where it's actually stored below the ground. I think I have a zoom of this. This is a system called salt domes. They're actually salt deposits that occur naturally within the ground, and they're actually miles and miles deep. This one is 3.8 miles below the ground. It's kind of a typical depth. They're hollowed out with water. A water jet hollows out these big vacuous spaces, and they're essentially used as oil, gas, and ethylene or brine storage. So the briny product that's created from hollowing these out is actually used as part of the industrial process. So in many ways, it's a kind of really intelligent use of this landscape system. And then these are used as large storage caverns for oil. And so the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve is actually, a majority of it is stored underground in these geological deposits in southern Louisiana. So the landscape's used in different ways, and then the kind of industrial layer on top of the landscape along the Mississippi River levee, along the river, actually transforms these raw products into a whole array of intermediate materials or intermediate chemicals, which are then transformed into a series of products. So continuing to trace that pipeline, we traced it to the refining facilities, looked at the processes by which that transformation occurs, and then looked at the kind of array of products that actually creates and that are consumed around the country. These products are kind of off the page because much of that actual production doesn't occur in southern Louisiana, it occurs around the country. And so a lot of that, the kind of job creation and economic wealth associated with making the final product is not captured within this particular landscape. It's a really low income area for most part. And we also trace the pipeline the other direction, beginning to look out into the Gulf of Mexico and think about where do the pipelines start and where do they pull from. And so this is a map of the network of oil and gas pipelines that extend out into the Gulf, that extend out into the offshore platforms. These are the deep water platforms. This is the Deepwater Horizon extent of the oil spill, kind of changing over time in this image. But here, again, it's really about looking at the vast network that supports the plastic bag, right, that we all use and consume, and the landscape that it truly shapes. And so again, I don't have time to kind of go through all of these chapters, but this was really this project about kind of connecting the dots, understanding these landscape systems, tracing these landscape systems, and kind of revealing new things about these places. So we began to look at waste systems, both how waste is deposited in the landscape through injection wells that go deep below ground into the water systems, into the air. And then also waste becomes deposited in kind of the human body when you begin to occupy these landscapes, or the body of a frog occupying these landscapes. And it's interesting, like during the lifetime of this project, the science has changed around much of this. And so chemicals that we were studying a couple years ago in this work that hadn't been listed as were kind of potentially toxic, as deemed so by the EPA, have now been put on the toxins list. So more and more information begins to kind of feed this research and this work. It's an ever-evolving kind of investigation. And then finally, this landscape has real impacts upon people, not just in terms of physical human health, but in terms of kind of occupation and displacement. So the kind of social network and social fracturing that's happened within these areas with the growth of many of these industries has been really devastating and really kind of transformative in many of these areas. So this is a mapping of a Dow chemical facility at Plaquemine, which was located next to a small community. As that facility grew, the community was relocated and kind of displaced into different areas. In some cases compensated for displacement, in some cases less so. But this is not an isolated instance. This is a kind of repetitive pattern of kind of land use transformation and change that's really driven by kind of big industry along the waterfront. And then this space is also really kind of dramatically transformed ecologically. So these are kind of drawings that articulate the really robust, interesting bayou landscape of southern Louisiana. That it's a very productive landscape that supports a huge amount of life. It's an estuarine landscape, the most productive landscapes in all the world. And how that extends, how that occurs kind of in layers, more freshwater layers, closer up to Baton Rouge and the northern portion of our study area, and kind of brackish, mixed, and saltwater layers as you extend offshore. And it's also really critical that this robust landscape, this water-based landscape, not only is biologically highly productive, it's also economically very productive in terms of the shrimp farms and the kind of shrimpers use these spaces here at the edges of the estuary. The shrimp life cycle is all based around being able to have their nursery zones in some of the brackish water areas, and being able to, as adults, kind of move into the saltwater areas. And so these estuarine edges are really important for a whole host of species that are very important for our seafood economy, our locally generated seafood economy in the States. What's interesting is that these exact edges, this exact same geographical area of the estuary edge, is also the zone that the petrochemical companies need to move through to get from the Gulf to the river. So there's a real dramatic juxtaposition in the kind of the needs of the space and the use of the space. And so the kind of this whole landscape, this whole wetland estuary is literally disappearing. Land loss occurs at a massive rate. The wetlands are sinking. This map is showing areas in blue as wetlands that have been lost, I believe, and areas in black are wetlands that are projected to be lost in the next 50 to 100 years. So this is huge amounts of land literally eroding into the water, and much of that, it's speculated, is occurring because of the canals that have been built through this wetland landscape, and the wave action that's brought in by those canals, and the intrusion of saltwater into freshwater zones is really transforming the ecosystems. And those canals are all driven and cut because of the need to move through that landscape to get from the Gulf into the river. And so this project really used drawing as a way of kind of connecting the dots and connecting the cycles. And as I said, it wasn't necessarily a very optimistic project. We tried to have optimistic moments within it, but I think we really learned a lot about the place and the production of this work. And we did try to kind of project how some of these very kind of negative and kind of downward spirals could be broken. And we made within all of our work, we try to be optimistic. We made a kind of catalog at the end that began to think about potential design solutions and policy solutions and kind of cultural kind of conditions that could help break some of these negative cycles in very small ways, in very cumulative ways. And so we came up with this glossary of terms and solutions for post-petrochemical culture. And again, I'm not going to kind of totally get into it, but many of these techniques are techniques that we really embrace in our work at SCAPE and all scales of our projects, in thinking about how to build regenerative landscapes and work with regenerative systems, biological systems. And so I think that transitions nicely into some of our more kind of projective design work that we've been doing. This is a project for Town Branch Commons. We're really thinking about how to design new kinds of systems. So rather than sticking with the status quo and kind of understanding or dealing with the landscape and the way you encounter it, how to project and adapt an existing system into a more regenerative one. This is a proposal for Lexington, Kentucky. So Lexington's a really interesting urban area in that it has an urban growth boundary. This is the urban growth boundary. You can really kind of see it expressed in the aerial. This is the kind of protected bluegrass landscape. So Lexington's really known for its kind of horse country, its horse culture, and its rolling bluegrass hills. It's really very iconic, very beautiful. Also kind of a productive landscape for the export of very high value racehorses. And then it's kind of more urban side, or side that's able to kind of be developed. So there's a really strong line between what is deemed urbanizable and what is left as a kind of more highly regulated landscape. And so this is a view of that kind of bluegrass landscape. And this is a water system called Town Branch that runs through it. And we were invited to Lexington to work on a competition for this water system. And the competition wasn't for the water system as it intersected the rural area, the bluegrass area. It was for the area where it intersected the city. And within the city, this is what the water system looks like. So Town Branch, this stream, which exists here, is a culvert below the road through Vine Street, through downtown Lexington. And so I think this juxtaposition is a really interesting kind of series of images, because this landscape is protected through the urbanization and densification of this landscape. However, this is not necessarily a place that you want to be. We kind of call this image the sea of beige. The very narrow kind of sidewalks, the very vehicular dominated condition. This is in the downtown core of Lexington, and Lexington has its many charms, but this particular street is not one of them, and it's one of these conditions where the urban environment hasn't kind of been designed in a way that's reflective of its kind of rural surroundings or the identity of the place. Nothing about this really speaks to bluegrass culture or the whole kind of culture around Lexington. And so the competition we were invited to participate in was a project called Town Branch Commons, and we were invited to come up with a strategy for actually revealing the waterway below the street. So this is a daylighting proposal. Daylighting means you're revealing a stream system back up to the daylight. And the proposal here it would really dramatically impact the cityscape, right? There's not much room for it. There's really nowhere to go. So a lot of the challenge of this project was to think creatively about how to reveal water in a very dense urban environment, but also how to dramatically transform that environment. And so we began to look at the ways the water system itself was expressed within Lexington. So this is Town Branch here in the foreground, right at the urban edge. But this is also Town Branch. So the waters that are underground, the kind of storm sewers, the culverts, the gutters, the manholes, those are all part of the water system of Town Branch within the city. This is a less glamorous part of the Town Branch water system. And this is a view of what Town Branch actually looks like below the ground on a very dry day when it's a very small trickle of water. So it's not a large river, it's actually a relatively modest kind of creek system. It is a perennial stream that appears, and this is the pathway by which it appears downtown right now. It actually occurs in 2 tunnels that run underneath the city. And so when we started this project and worked in this competition, we really wanted to rethink the system, right? Kind of design a new way of managing water within the urban environment, kind of rethink the idea that water has to be something that's contained and below ground and out of sight, out of mind. And we began to look at how does water express itself within other parts of Kentucky. And we were led to this geologic map here, which is a map of karst. And karst is a type of limestone that's highly porous, and it actually influences how water flows below its surface. And so Lexington is blue because it has a lot of karst there. And we were very interested in that. And we began to learn that not only does karst have this really interesting way of modifying water movement, it also makes the water more basic and is really tied back to the kind of culture of Lexington. So there's a lot of rumors that because the water is more basic, it's much better water for making bourbon, for distilling bourbon. It's a rumor. I don't think that's actually true, because when you distill, the flavor comes out. But people like to say that. But also, people say that it makes the grass grow greener and the horse's bones grow stronger. So it's really kind of deeply tied in these kind of like iconic Lexington icons, but it is this geologic formation. And so the way the water flows in a karst ecosystem, or a karst geology system, is that it doesn't simply flow in a stream along the surface. It actually moves through this highly porous bedrock. So you have these moments where water kind of appears and then disappears and then reappears in very interesting formations. And so we began to go look at some of these systems. This is a kind of part of a stream, but it looks like an isolated pond because it's fed from below and then dives back into the ground below. Interrupted stream channels, a stream channel that begins and ends and begins and ends. Swallow is where water kind of disappears, or it appears from a crack in the landscape. Karst windows, where the ground actually opens up and you see into the water below. And then sinks. This is a really interesting moment because this water is running right into what looks like a solid rock wall. And then boils, a kind of naturally occurring type of fountain where water will emerge out in a kind of fountain-like formation during a rainstorm when you have high-pressure water pushing against it. And so we thought, how can we really adapt this urban hydrology to reflect more of the karst hydrology and think about moments of having the water truly reveal itself within Lexington, where there's more space to kind of embrace water and have room for it and let it flood certain areas. In areas where it isn't possible to reveal because it's so tightly constricted, how can we think about cleaning and treating the water of Town Branch in a kind of interrupted way above the surface? How can we carve out zones and kind of reveal water in different ways and kind of reveal little kind of peepholes down to the water systems below? And then how can we use water as a kind of connective feature to kind of connect and bridge different kind of currently divided communities? And so these words, reveal, clean, carve, connect, became really operative in how we thought about water in a very diverse way across these very diverse sections of the city. And so these little blue cross sections really begin to speak on how water can begin to do many of these different things, and the kind of design of this infrastructure can do many different things. And so again, reveal at the moments where there is more room. So this is a kind of a large parking lot that we've repurposed into a kind of iconic downtown park for Lexington that's really framed around water rooms and smaller pockets of water, trying to create a floodable landscape. And these are some images of what that transformation could potentially begin to look like and the kind of micro spaces it would create. Moments of cleaning the water in kind of more tightly constricted street sections. Think about continuing this expression of water along the surface, not in a linear way, but in an interrupted way that reflects that kind of interrupted karst hydrology. And so here we see kind of pools and pockets of water beginning to appear, reappear, and disappear. Carved, kind of more dramatic moments where the urban fabric is literally carved away, creating room for the expression of water and also creating room for much needed public space in downtown Lexington. Trying to provide different programs that would kind of activate the area throughout the day and the night, throughout multiple seasons. And then connect, thinking about water as a truly kind of connective feature. These are kind of two very divided neighborhoods, a rail line that runs through here, and that how water in tandem with the kind of streetscape redesign could really allow for enhanced kind of connections and exchanges across. And so that was a kind of competition proposal, and really about how do we adapt an existing system to have more of a kind of regenerative capacity, and to really reflect and embrace its landscape systems. I'm going to speak for a little bit longer now on this project, Living Breakwaters, which is a kind of proposal for a whole new way of thinking about coastal protection within the South Shore of Staten Island. This is a kind of project that was based around Hurricane Sandy and the kind of devastation that occurred within the city here. And so this project is called Living Breakwaters. And I have these pink slides kind of interspersed into this portion because I think this is where I think the kind of role of the designer was very clear in the last two projects, but this project is really a project that kind of tries to expand the role of a designer, and I would challenge all of you this evening to really think about how within your work you're not purely just designing a place, you're also designing a process and a set of partners and a set of kind of engagement strategies in a place, and that requires not only great design thinking, it requires great design leadership, and this is something that we have tried to test in this work. And so when we think about, this lecture is titled Next Century Infrastructure, and I've kind of tried to take the position that designers have a bigger role in thinking about the infrastructure of our country. We know that the United States has infrastructure that's in really terrible shape, right? Our bridges, our highways, we have a lot of kind of challenges in the next 100 years. The infrastructure of the water system of Town Branch needs to be redesigned, and we've proposed some ways that could happen. But really, I think designers can play a much larger role in the kind of conversations around how infrastructure is designed. And these are kind of 7 points that really begin to articulate, I think, what we offer. One is that we're kind of setting new targets for what are the goals for a new infrastructure design project. We're kind of creating tools for more intelligent decision making. In many of those cases, they're kind of visual tools. I think a lot of our work really focuses on kind of fostering interdisciplinary design and kind of unexpected interdisciplinary design. A lot of our work revolves around trying to design with science to kind of engage in this world of engineering and science-driven engineering and really adapt that to science-driven design. Engage communities in the conversations around infrastructure because ultimately many of these systems kind of land in a particular place with a particular community. Creating place, I think, is maybe always the role of a designer, and that's something that can't be lost in these kind of larger scale projective projects. And then I think designers really have the ability to kind of anticipate and visually articulate uncertain futures and think about how larger scale projects that maybe have longer scale timeframes can really begin to adapt to uncertain futures. So I'm going to kind of call on these points throughout this presentation. But so Living Breakwaters was a proposal that was developed for the HUD Rebuild by Design competition. We were one of the only landscape architecture-led team participating in the competition, and I think Barke will be here next week or the week after, speaking for BIG, architect-led designer, and hopefully he'll speak on this project, and you kind of look at the kind of differences between the work. Both very, very interesting projects and proposals, but developed through the same competition. So HUD Rebuild by Design. HUD is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, responsible for funding a lot of disaster recovery. After Sandy hit, HUD organized a design competition, which is really innovative and interesting because typically HUD kind of just hands out money to whoever is able to kind of organize to ask for it the fastest and the quickest. And so in this scenario, HUD was saying, we're not looking to fund exclusively projects that build back what existed exactly. We're looking to fund some projects that have more innovative projective proposals for how can we build back better and how can we build back systems that are more resilient than the ones we currently had. And so 10 teams of designers, architects, planners, ecologists assembled to respond to this competition. And this was our response with Living Breakwaters. And so this is our team. So it was led by a landscape architect, but it was by no means exclusively designed by landscape architects. So SCAPE led the team, but we had a really interesting kind of cast of characters here. So we have 3 major engineering firms. Parsons Brinckerhoff. Stevens Institute of Technology is a school, but we had some engineers and hydrodynamic modelers working on this project. Ocean and Coastal Consultants is an engineering firm that focuses around the maritime environment. But we also had kind of marine biologists. So CR Consulting is a group of marine biologists actually based in Israel that develop new materials for the maritime environment that are more ecologically sensitive. The New York Harbor School was a partner on our project, so we had educators and students as part of our infrastructure design team. Low Tech was our architecture firms. We had architects on our team as well, graphic designers, MTWTF, and then Paul Greenberg, who's a writer. He's written a really great book, recently released, called The American Catch, and he writes kind of about the state of America's fisheries. So there's a lot of themes in this project that you've seen in past work: design around water, design around systems-based design, and then also the kind of idea of the aquatic environment as a very fragile and environment to think about protecting. But our assembly of this team was really to think about fostering interdisciplinary design, and really thinking about design collaboration as moving beyond coordination and truly bringing all of these players into the design process from the get-go. And so that I would really encourage all of you to think about forging unexpected collaborations and kind of unexpected partners on your design teams, because it's been really productive for us. So this is a kind of just some of the people involved in this work. But this project really focuses around three kind of goals. So we are kind of constantly asked, how do we define resiliency? And within this project, we're defining resiliency three different ways. One is kind of true physical resiliency, thinking about risk reduction from a physical perspective. How can we design our shorelines in a way that reduce risk to people living along the edges? One is kind of about social resiliency and what kind of culture. How do we think about a design project and a design process that not only reduces risk along the shoreline, but educates people and makes them more aware of the risks and builds a kind of society, a water-educated society along the shore. And then the third is ecological resiliency, trying to really tie in ecosystems thinking into all of our work, and understanding that ecosystems need to be as kind of resilient and as robust to exist in the future as human communities do. And so this is really to that point of, I think designers can really help catalyze these conversations around setting new targets for hybrid infrastructure, that we don't have to think about purely building a wall that's only responding to the physical questions around risk reduction. How can we build a wall or a landscape or a shoreline that's more adaptive, that has positive ecological implications and positive implications for society? And so this work is really informed by a lot of regional analysis. So when you think about kind of risks in water-dependent or water-based cities, of which New York is one, we have to think about how it relates to other places around the world. So the Netherlands is often brought up as an example of designing with water and designing around water, but the Netherlands doesn't actually have hurricanes. So if you think about designing for the 500-year flood or the 10,000-year flood, that's really a much smaller variable or distance or difference in elevation than in New York City, which receives hurricanes. So if you're thinking about setting a flood wall elevation in the Netherlands, you can set it relatively reliably. In New York, you have to set it much higher, right? It's 8.9 feet. It's kind of fallen off the edge here. 3.6 feet versus 8.9 feet is quite a big difference when you think about the impact of a kind of protective measure. And so that was a kind of interesting conclusion for us. Another really interesting conclusion for us in our kind of regional research was that not only are human communities at risk, and that was very well described after Sandy, the many, many impacts, that death, disease in some instances, injury to personal property, private property, all kinds of impacts, but also impacts to ecosystems and projected future impacts to ecosystems. So the storm damaged a lot of the urban ecosystems within New York, but what sea level rise, the kind of threat of sea level rise brings is actually the erasure of many of the kind of remnants of functional ecosystems that still exist in New York. So areas like Jamaica Bay, which have large marshlands, as sea levels rise, those areas will likely be underwater. Because we have so many hard edges in New York City and many waterfront cities, as sea levels rise, there's nowhere for that water to go. It simply just goes up. And so these water-based economies, much like in Louisiana, even in New York, we do have water-based economies, kind of fishing, clamming, shellfishing, that have value and that are also in jeopardy of being lost. And so as an office, we were really interested in this idea of bay landscapes and how these bay landscapes could be kind of designed as more productive ecosystems and ecosystems that actually helped protect people. And so we looked at these kind of shallow water ecosystems. They kind of range in their variability, and thought about, rather than a singular approach of building a kind of singular piece of flood control infrastructure along the water's edge, how do we design a layered approach, a kind of series of shallow water ecosystems, designed ecosystems that help reduce risk to the shoreline, still allow water to kind of permeate the system in some ways, but that also kind of create a culture of resiliency and a culture of understanding the water and living with water. So our proposal really reaches from upland to offshore across this full cross-section, and is really about trying to build a kind of new way of dealing with rising waters. And so a lot of our work was kind of about testing and looking at different sites. I'm going to skip through some of this, but I'll talk more specifically about Staten Island and talk about it in the kind of chunks of these three categories. So from a perspective of risk, Staten Island's highly vulnerable in that it gets much of the wave action that comes in through the New York Bight. So this is the geomorphological conditions that shape New Jersey and Long Island. They actually Sandy was kind of funneled in through that, and it hit Staten Island very, very hard. And that kind of force was expressed in many different ways along the different shoreline edges. So our site was within the South Shore, and we chose that site because there was flooding. There was a lot of risk and damage incurred in that area, but there was also a lot of erosion that occurred within that area, and that was something we felt could be mitigated through this layered approach. And so when you begin to look at shoreline change within Staten Island, in the last 100 years, there's been acres and acres of land that has been lost, and that loss is projected to occur within the future. And that's really evident within the shoreline itself. You walk on the shoreline and you see moments where this used to be it was a historic road, and this is the kind of, retired water line now appearing in the beach because the beach has eroded so far back. Buildings that are actually elevated, maybe out of the floodplain, are still at risk because the cliffs are eroding, so their structural foundations are compromised. Infrastructure failure has occurred along the edge, and that seawalls and platforms have collapsed. And then there's just really kind of fragile conditions. This is an emergency dune system that's been put in place, and the shoreline is so narrow that it has to be the trap bags inside that dune system are exposed. This is from the other side of that dune system, so those emergency types of protection have real physical implications in terms of how you access the water. So the series of benches that used to have a waterfront experience and was part of that community identity has now been compromised. And then there's also water-based economies that, though you can't simply kind of solve the question of what to do about surge inundation with a kind of singular wall-like infrastructure, because here you really need access to the water as part of that ecosystem. And so we landed on this strategy of breakwaters, which is a kind of traditional engineering technique. It was kind of inspired by traditional engineering techniques. And what breakwaters do is that they reduce wave action and can reduce erosion in sites such as these that are highly vulnerable. So they're kind of like rocky islands that are in the water offshore, and they break waves. And so the wave would approach from one side, it hits the rocky island, and it's dissipated, and you have an area of slow, calm water behind. What they also do is, depending upon the proximity that you place them in relation to the shoreline, is they build beaches. So the shore can actually grow behind them as opposed to disappearing. And so we had a lot of kind of conversations with the community, Tottenville community, and the rest of the South Shore, in what this kind of structure can do, it can't do. So the most important thing here is that it has all these positive attributes. It can reduce erosion, it can lessen wave impacts. It literally reduces and eliminates the most life-threatening aspects of a storm surge, which is high velocity water coming at you. Very slow moving, slow rising water is much safer than very high velocity water. It can provide habitat underwater. It can encourage recreational fisheries, and it can help build beaches. What it does not do is keep out the floodwater. So this was a project that really embraces the idea that if you live along the waterfront, especially in kind of conditions such as these, that we need to kind of develop ways of embracing water and living with water as part of our foreseeable future. And so again, this is a strategy that's really framed around designing for uncertain futures. It's a strategy that's not about setting a flood wall elevation that can be overtopped. And if it was overtopped, it would be overtopped catastrophically. This is a project that's about dissipating some of that energy and some of that risk and some of that force without kind of recognizing that we may never know exactly how high a wave may be or a flood level may be. And these are images that we made to kind of describe that. I'm going to skip through some of these. But the proposal really was to think about a kind of necklace of breakwaters that would extend across the South Shore, from the South Shore of Tottenville. This is actually called the South Pole in Staten Island. It's the southernmost point of New York State. There's like a little pole there you can take your photo next to. Kind of extending up to this land formation, which is called Great Kills. And so within each of these zones and sites, the breakwater system would be designed as an archipelago, a kind of man-made archipelago of islands that would help grow the beach, help reduce wave action within this area, and create this zone of shallow water that could be occupied in different ways. And it's highly replicable in that the system has a couple of different kind of component parts. It has a series of breakwaters, but it's also about the space behind that's created, that calm, slow water space. It can be layered with other pieces of shoreline infrastructure, like the emergency dune system that's in place there now, but also really needs to be kind of connected to a way of accessing and programming the waterfront. So this is a strategy that we had of these kind of architectural structures that would populate the shoreline called water hubs, which would be kind of literal bridges between a neighborhood and its water's edge. And then, so that kind of cross-section can repeat and vary in many different ways along the shoreline. And so it can adapt, be more subtidal and more ecologically sensitive areas, and kind of inspire new occupations of the shoreline and protect kind of marinas and water-based economies. And so within our work, a lot of our work really looks at how to test these design ideas, because this is a really big picture design idea. There's no breakwater system this large in the United States. So this is a kind of really interesting proposal, but unless you really begin to kind of test it and study it rigorously, it remains a proposal. And so we worked with Stevens Institute to do some very high-level modeling for the competition, and now we're advancing into much more iterative, grounded modeling. But this is the hydrodynamic model that shows wave conditions during Sandy. And so there's really kind of high waves here, 6-foot waves hitting the shoreline. And with the breakwater system in place, you really begin to see how that wave condition could be transformed. So these are the results of the hydrodynamic model, where we have, in some cases, up to 5-foot wave reduction, which is very dramatic. And so this is really a kind of plug for thinking about inviting these different kind of partners into your design conversations earlier rather than later, and kind of testing in a really iterative way these different design ideas and design configurations. It's also really critical that much of this work really builds upon the work that other agencies and partners and stakeholders are performing. So this is the city scale plan for coastal adaptation within New York City post-Sandy. It's called the SIRR report, Special Initiative in Rebuilding and Resiliency. And it identifies a kind of layered series of coastal protection along the South Shore that includes reef or breakwater systems. We also worked a lot with the New York State recovery process called New York Rising. It was also kind of mobilizing community members to think more projectively about shoreline conditions. And so a lot of our work here was really about visual communication, articulating the kind of risks that we saw in these neighborhoods and the opportunities. And so this allowed, a lot of our drawings allowed us to have a much larger and more engaging conversation with a larger, more diverse group of stakeholders than is typically had in these kinds of planning conversations. And so again, the federal government is also a kind of big stakeholder in this area, and that the Army Corps is doing an intervention on the East Shore, but has not yet publicly proposed the intervention for the South Shore. So in this instance, we felt that our project was kind of serving an unmet need. And then from an ecosystem perspective, and this is personally where I get really excited, kind of one of my passions, is to really think about the kind of value of designing for ecosystems, thinking about fish as your client as well as people as your client. So we're really interested in ecosystems at SCAPE for many reasons. One is because it's very important for longevity of the world and our population to have biodiverse ecosystems in urban areas. But also in that ecosystems are an economy, they can be an infrastructure, and they can be a kind of a technique for education. And so we thought about ecology in a number of different ways in this project. And the first way was to really think about the kind of existing urban ecosystems that were flourishing in this site. And so one of those, or many of those, are different fish species that use Raritan Bay, which is the bay landscape that is directly adjacent to the south shore of Staten Island. And so we thought about how to design a project that could be constructed around the life cycles of the different organisms that use this space. There's also really interesting economies here. One of those is the hard clamming economy. So it's fascinating. You don't necessarily think about clams coming from New York City, but there is a legal transplant area for commercial clammers on the south shore of Staten Island, in that you're able to harvest clams from this zone, transplant them to Long Island, let them sit and clean for a couple of weeks in the cleaner Long Island water, and then sell them on the market as Long Island clams. So if you've had clam chowder in New York City, it's quite possible you've had Staten Island clam chowder. And so this is a kind of important economy for Staten Island. It's an important natural resource. And so the regulators actually advised us to meet with some of the hard clammers and identify where these hard clams actually existed, where they were high abundance populations. And we designed the proposal kind of around that. But in addition to trying to protect ecosystems, we're landscape architects. We really aggressively believe that our role in this work is to help think about designing the ecosystems of the future, and that if we don't think about actively designing landscapes of the future, we will end up with no future landscapes, or no productive future landscapes. And so we really tried to look at what organisms use this space and could be facilitated within this project, designed for within this project, and we found out that juvenile fish are a really kind of critical group of organisms that use Raritan Bay. So there's large ocean-going adult structure-loving fish that use the ocean. They actually spawn way up the Hudson in this estuarine network. They use the Hudson as a nursery, so little baby fish are living in the Hudson, and then those baby fish travel to Raritan Bay and spend 6 months to a year kind of growing up in the bay. So we have juvenile fish living in Raritan Bay, and we thought about how we could design our project to provide structure and habitat for juveniles. And I say structure because juvenile fish really need these little tiny pore spaces. They need spaces to shelter and hide from much larger predators that would gobble them up. And so historically, many of those little tiny pore spaces were offered in the form of oyster reefs, which provide very complex environments. But the oyster reefs have really disappeared from New York Harbor in the last 100 years. And so those can be kind of artificially reproduced through other means, through kind of rocky structures of different sizes that create similar pore spaces. They can also be reintroduced through oyster reefs. And so a typical breakwater is kind of designed as a line. It just becomes a kind of line in the water that's directly kind of have a kind of protective shadow behind it that's in relation to the shoreline. And so we thought about how to modify this based upon these ecosystem demands. So we modified the form to avoid critical habitat, and then we also really tried to modify the form to add localized microscale complexity. And this is where our conversations with the marine biologists became very important, because as a designer we came to this project and we said, oh, this project should look like a lot of really naturally kind of looking free-form geomorphic islands. And then our marine biologist said, well, that's great for you because it might look like a functional ecosystem, but it's not so great for a juvenile fish, which can't recognize complexity at that scale. So what the human eye recognizes is not necessarily what the eye of the juvenile fish recognizes as a safe environment or habitat. And so our work really focused on creating these moments of localized complexity, and which we're calling reef streets, which are here, and then orienting them towards the wave direction so that those habitat moments don't get full of sediment. So they're always kind of flushed out by rapidly moving water. And so these reef streets is a kind of view into them. So this little space is this larger space here. And we're trying to create a space where juvenile fish would feed in the street and then shelter in the structure. And we're using a whole mix and composite of materials to create these little habitat niches for this populations of fish. And this is the material that CR Consulting out of Israel is developing. It's ecological concrete. It's optimized for the maritime environment. It's also optimized for maritime construction, so it meets all the specs and the requirements of maritime concrete. But it has much higher habitat recruitment capability, so more organisms will grow on this material than on a typical maritime concrete material. It's also shaped and formed to create these different sizes of holes. So there's a lot of layers of texture happening here. There's a really micro texture that's happening in these little tiny holes. There's a medium texture that's happening with these creases across the space, and then these larger pockets and holes. And each of these holes will be designed for the size of a particular fish species that's known to locate here, or projected to locate here based upon climate change. And this is a kind of cross-section of the kind of habitat characteristics of the reef street and of the breakwater overall. And so while a lot of the work has really focused around the underwater environment of shellfish and juvenile fish, and lobsters, there's also this kind of intertidal and exposed habitat element of marine mammals like harbor seals, which are returning to New York Harbor and need places to kind of haul out and climb up on top of. So the project really tries to embrace habitat development from subtidal conditions up to exposed conditions. And then our office loves oysters. If you know the work of our office, you'll know that. But oysters have a really kind of critical historic role within New York City, but especially Staten Island. The community of Tottenville, which is at the South Pole of Staten Island, it was known as the town the oyster built. And that's because the oyster economy was so robust there that it actually caused a small town to be developed. This is an image of Mount Loretto, which is right here on this map. And it's actually oyster farmers tonging for oysters off the shore of Staten Island. And so there used to be these kind of historic beds of oysters within this area, kind of shoals and shallow water areas where they're really robust oyster reef populations. But then as the oyster economy became more robust and those reefs began to become over-harvested, those beds were actually expanded. So the footprint of oysters is actually expanded due to human activity in the past, and these aquaculture zones were implemented. Then, unfortunately, as kind of industry advanced and the harbor traffic increased and dredging increased, over-harvesting increased, water quality decreased, oysters basically, the industry collapsed, and oysters, all the populations, kind of the biological populations collapsed as well. So oysters were kind of all but lost from New York Harbor, as is the case in many urban estuaries. But what's very exciting is there's a lot of efforts now to restore oysters to New York Harbor. The water quality conditions since the passage of the Clean Water Act have dramatically improved. In many places, it's more possible to restore oysters. And this is a map that the Harbor Estuary Program produced, which is all the yellow zones are showing zones optimized for potential oyster restoration. So we're trying to work with all these groups that are looking to restore the species to the harbor, integrate it into this large infrastructure proposal. And so you might be curious why. Like, why does the oyster matter? What makes it interesting? There's this like ecological destiny element to it, but beyond that, what's the point? And so oysters are really interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, they actually grow into reefs, which are wave attenuating structures. They can actually help enhance the performance capabilities of these structures. They also, oysters along with barnacles and other organisms that secrete calcium carbonate, perform this function called biogenic buildup, which is they can actually make structures stronger because they're building up this thick calcium carbonate crust on top of them. It makes them last longer, it makes them stronger. They have been proven to grow along with the threat of climate change, so to think about adaptive infrastructure and biologically responsive living infrastructure, this could be a huge benefit to this work. They also improve water quality in that they filter water. They remove nutrient contaminants from water. So that's hugely important in New York City, where there's a lot of excessive nutrients in the water column due to our combined sewer overflow system. But oysters are also a great educational teaching tool, and they're a keystone species. So all of that habitat complexity and structural complexity really creates habitat for other species. There's some real concerns with oyster restoration in New York City, and most of them are related to kind of human health and safety. One is that they've been deemed by regulators as an attractive nuisance. So you're not supposed to eat oysters out of New York City Harbor. You're not supposed to eat, that's why you have to transplant the hard clams to cleaner waters before you eat them, because of our combined sewer overflow system, you could be eating oysters that have been consuming raw sewage, right? So that's not great. There's this question of like habitat displacement. If we want to restore oysters in a place that has clams, is it worthwhile to displace that habitat for this other habitat? So there's real questions, real serious ecological questions around this, but there's a lot of kind of science and ways of testing this. And so we've tried to embrace oyster restoration in a number of ways within our project. I can speak to this more, but I'll do that if there's questions on it. But we're looking at kind of diversity of techniques. We also, we also love oysters because they're a great kind of communication tool. People are really into the oyster. They're kind of like a charismatic microfauna of New York Harbor. People really want to talk about them. They really resonate with this place in Staten Island because of its history. This is a woman who made her, I promise we did not ask her to do this, she made her own oyster hat and handed out flyers for a kind of community engagement event that we were having and to kind of spread word on the project. And so oysters really became not only a kind of ecosystem engineer in the project, but also kind of a kind of community catalyst. So here we're working with the Harbor School, which is a school based in New York City, and they're a school that bases their entire curriculum around the waterfront. And what they've helped us do within this project as project partners is identify schools that are close to the water, within walking distance of the water. There's a ton of them in Staten Island. And think about how these schools could really participate in the design of this infrastructure and the stewardship of this infrastructure. And so the Billion Oysters program is a project that the Harbor School has developed to have their students come out and teach teachers how to grow oysters and how to have their classrooms grow oysters. And so as part of the competition process, we actually had a number of Harbor School students come out and do these workshops for teachers on Staten Island. And we made a kind of design product for the competition, which is the Oyster Gardening Manual, which is being used now in Staten Island to help kind of spread this message about oyster gardening along the shoreline and kind of classroom education. And so as part of this larger initiative of kind of connecting people to the water and educating on the risks of living in the water, we need to think about not only school communities, but also larger communities and how do we access and use the water spaces and how do we use the shoreline and the shallow water zone behind the breakwaters. And so our proposal here was really for a system of architectural structures called water hubs that would appear along the shoreline at multiple conditions in multiple places. They could embed themselves in multiple ways along the water's edge, either as floating infrastructure embedded within some of those kind of cliff conditions or kind of being bridges over dunes and other shoreline infrastructure that's in place. And so they would be kind of very connected to their kind of adjacent communities and also programmed by the community by which they would serve. So this is the proposal for Staten Island. This is developed by low-tech architects. And the programming for the structure was developed by the Tottenville Civic Association, Kayak Staten Island, which is a group that does a lot of kayaking, obviously, and Conference House Park, Friends of Conference House Park, which is the park site where it's being located. And so part of the proposal here is a design proposal about how to engage communities in the design process and think about how we want to kind of be occupying the shore. So this is one of those kind of planning workshops where we built oyster cages as part of the kind of education around this project. SCAPE helped facilitate a number of kind of, I would say, alternative design tools to engage communities in this larger conversation about living infrastructure. So this is a model that we didn't actually build the model. We designed the process by which the model could be built, and then we went to the Staten Island Makerspace, which is the community facility, and had a number of Staten Island residents actually fabricate this model. So everyone kind of participated in this effort, and then it became this kind of teaching tool for the younger generation. And so again, kind of within this arc of what are we planning for, what are we designing for, a lot of this work is work that might be built in the next, or might exist in the next 50 or 100 years. So kind of thinking and talking to the kind of future ecosystem stewards is really kind of critical piece of our project, like designing for our intergenerational audience. And so that's really the point of this kind of pink bubble here, which is really trying to create new tools and engage communities and really think about design as a way of kind of catalyzing engagement and catalyzing future stewardship of projects. So as part of our effort here, we weren't simply trying to kind of articulate a physical design proposal. We were trying to design a community process that would build the future stewards of it. And so as part of the Rebuild by Design process, we had to submit all kinds of rationale for the project, including a cost-benefit proposal and a kind of regulatory framework. And we identified a pilot out of this process. And this pilot is located here in Tottenville. It's the kind of phase one of the proposal. And we were very lucky that was selected for funding by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And the implementation partner is the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. And so that is a state-led organization who is responsible for executing this work, and they were given $60 million to implement this work in the next 5 years. And so it's a very exciting moment for us as an office because we're able to kind of participate in this conversation about infrastructure design, in many ways lead the concept design of this plan, and be involved with it as it evolves in the future. And this is a really cheesy image, and I want to end on this because I think it does really speak to this idea of we are trying to do all these kind of bigger picture goals of designing future spaces that are adaptive to these uncertain conditions and can have real protective capacity within them and biological capacity. But we're also really trying to create place and build places that resonate and function every day, and that's a huge part of what I think designers bring to the infrastructure conversation, is that this can't be infrastructure that operates once, it has to be infrastructure that operates every day. And so I'm just going to end on this image, which is the kind of image from the competition, but really has the kind of three elements of the project embedded within it. The kind of social kind of programming and infrastructure along the shoreline, the breakwater and ecological infrastructure within the water, and then the kind of shallow water kind of calm zone that really resonates and functions on every day in the foreground. So I'm going to end there, but I really appreciate your attention tonight, and I hope there's some kind of like sparks of ideas here that kind of make you think differently about the role of a designer in projects of this nature. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, let's hit the lights. Yep, you got it. Are there any questions for Gena?
Yeah.
Thanks so much. This last project, I think also the one in Lexington, you talk a little bit about interface with public policy and public officials and what your relationships are there, what your battles might be there.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, it's both very positive and very negative, right? And often with like the same people and the same questions. I think it's one thing that designers really bring to the conversation is the ability to expand the conversation with regulators or policymakers or public officials, because so often the kind of connections between like oyster restoration and coastal protection are not obvious, right? Like we're saying here, we'd like to use federal funds to think about jointly doing ecosystem restoration and storm protection. And you say that and you get a kind of blank stare from a politician, right? Who like wants to see something built in 2 years and wants to see it protect the community to the highest level of protection possible. But you begin to talk about, okay, well, this is what the shoreline will look like in that scenario, but this is what it also can look like in a different scenario. Think about kind of connecting in these social aspects, thinking about connecting in these ecological aspects, and you can really shift the conversation around what it is. I mean, the challenges are also really clear, I think. The challenges are the kind of bureaucratic processes and procedures that drive much of this work. So in the case of Town Branch, one of the real challenges is kind of interfacing with the Vine Street is a state highway. So thinking about interfacing with the state Kentucky Transportation Cabinet and their design guidelines. Their design guidelines are specifically formulated for highways, right? Mostly these are highways that move around cities, large elevated expressways in most cases. And that's partially why that landscape looks the way it does. The kind of parameters, design parameters around that landscape have caused very wide lanes, very high and fast traffic, very few and far between spaced traffic lights. So the design proposal is as much of a kind of rethinking of the streetscape as it is a kind of rethinking of the way water integrates with that streetscape. But again, the kind of visual tools I think are really useful in kind of making a visual argument for it that's based in a particular place, in a particular cross-section. In the case of living breakwaters, the challenges are also regulatory challenges, and it's very difficult to think about how do we fill the water, right? I mean, the Clean Water Act was put in place for a reason, and it really severely limits the amount of impact you can have in water environment. And so though much of the work we're trying to do is aimed to be positive. Right now we're beginning to initiate a long design process to actually confirm that there won't be negative impacts to water quality, negative impacts to habitats due to sedimentation and beach growth, and try to begin to make sure that we're not causing more negative impacts than positive impacts. But again, I think the kind of visual communication tools and like the I showed Petrochemical America because it really talks about how to make the connections between systems. This work does that as well, and visually creates evidence for it and helps change the conversation that you're having around a particular problem.
Are there others?
Gena, thanks. Your work is super smart. With this particular project and the pilot or the test phase, how far is that funded? What's definitely going to happen?
Well, so that question truly needs to be directed to the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, but I will answer in the capacity I'm able to, which is that the project is funded for $60 million, and that was the anticipated cost estimate for the construction of that segment. So it was, the cost estimate was for like 74 million and 60 is funded. So a huge percentage is funded, and the system is flexible. And so we feel like it will be possible to construct a majority of what was shown within that pilot frame with those funds. And that includes kind of the design process, the iterative design modeling process, the regulatory process. The project is beginning to go under environmental review. There's a kind of scoping document circulating about environmental impact and setting up an environmental impact statement for the work. And there's always opportunity to fundraise more for this project. We're always looking for additional funding for the work, but I think within the Rebuild by Design competition, it was one of the smaller projects, but it was the project that received the greatest percentage of its construction budget for implementation. So we're very, very happy about that.
Probably just talk on that, but I'm very interested in where you ended your lecture with this image here, and I really appreciate the intercollaboration between design and science and community. Can you talk a little bit about the piece of architecture that we're looking at right now? I assume that this is something that's coming out of low-tech, but maybe you could talk about the interaction between architecture and those components as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really valid question, and it's true. The architecture is truly the baby of low tech, and so I don't want to put too many words in their mouth. But what I would say was this project really tried to design a pathway for designing that architecture in the future, and so the kind of physical form is very important within this work, but it's just as important as the community partners we brought in to shape that physical form. So we met with this kind of smaller consortium of community partners. We'd like to expand that as the project advances, but it really was these kind of people that are using the shoreline and see opportunity to use it more. So the structure is really designed to kind of be a bridge over the dune system. There's a lot of regulatory concern about this in terms of what watery environments it begins to build within, whether it's building within the coastal erosion hazard zone. So there's certain parameters that need to be kind of thought about within this proposal. But the structure really acts as a bridge. It also acts as a kind of icon. Low-Tech is known for their work using repurposed materials, a lot of repurposed shipping containers, which is the source for this structure. And which actually makes a lot of sense in the South Shore of Staten Island because it is a landscape. So right beyond those breakwaters is a very large navigation channel that leads to the Arthur Kill. So shipping containers are something that you constantly see if you live along the shoreline of Staten Island. They're kind of part of the context of the place. But then also the kind of, the point of the structure is that it's floodable up to the kind of inhabitable floor. So the lower zones are actually used for kayak storage as kind of amphitheater style seating as spaces that can be flooded during a storm event, and then certain protected zones that are kind of more climate proofed, or areas that are interior and areas that host wet labs and classrooms and kind of teaching spaces or community facilities. It's kind of a real lack of community facilities in the South Shore, so places to gather, especially along the waterfront, would be a really big contribution. And then also it has this kind of projective form because it's oriented towards a lot of the views of the water, of the breakwater system, and then also some of the views back towards Conference House Park, which is a kind of more wooded maritime forest landscape. So it's trying to give you these different kind of views and kind of isolate these different ecosystems that you're within, because you truly are one of the most kind of like dynamic pieces of the shoreline ecosystem, right at that moment of you know, where wet becomes dry, that kind of long gradient.
Are there any others? I have a question then.
Yeah.
With the Petrochemical America project, there's no doubt that a tremendous amount of effort goes into uncovering all of those facts, cataloging them, representing them in a way that kind of paints a larger picture, and then of course yields a catalog of methods and strategies that might alleviate some of the problems there. I'm wondering, to what extent is that project ongoing? Does your office feel like they need to carry forward and make those strategies get put into place, or is it kind of a provocation and you hope others pick it up?
I mean, I think as a project, it's a provocation, but I think it's also a kind of internal provocation, in that we don't have any active projects in southern Louisiana right now, but we do try to take those lessons and apply them to our work, right? So every project we work in the landscape architecture industry. We're based in New York City. A lot of our work are very urban landscapes, and if you look at the cross-section, my students know this, if you look at the cross-section of an urban landscape, it's highly constructed and a lot of it is made of plastic, right? So we're all real participants in this kind of, this idea of kind of petrochemical extraction. The landscape it forms plays a really active role in a lot of our work, so we're always trying to kind of work against that, innovate against that. But we're also trying to think about it in a much kind of bigger picture systems way. So I would say Petrochemical America is something that's very much in our minds, but it's also very much in our working methodology and how we approach these types of projects. We're always thinking about the kind of system scale implications and how to design regenerative systems and systems that don't have those kind of destructive cycles and don't have those moments of saying, here's the waste product from this system, it's out of sight, out of mind. How do we regenerate that as part of a landscape?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Hamza had a question. Oh,
One more?
we have two questions.
Hurry up.
So you have a few architects, like MR architects, working at SCAPE, and so knowing, like dealing with them and also having taught at other programs, I don't know if this was your first kind of teaching gig at just an architecture program, but what kind of disciplinary dissonances that you found with your colleagues that kind of informed how you would teach the students here, and maybe potentially work with people like tech and other architects?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, so I've taught at Columbia, and then the architects within our office are typically kind of coming out of an urban design program as well. So I would say one of the disciplinary disconnects is often the idea of very multi-scalar thinking. I'm not trying to be critical. I think architects are very good at addressing multiple scales, obviously, in much of work. But the idea of designing a system at multiple scales and thinking about how a site participates in a larger system, I think is always kind of one of the challenges. It's a challenge for me constantly, and I've been trained in it, and I've been trained in horticulture, I've been trained in biology, I've been trained in wildlife conservation, so I have a lot of, you know, that kind of past education around thinking about multi-scalar systems. I would also say, I think the other kind of really interesting thing about SCAPE and about what I've been introduced to kind of working at SCAPE, and I think is starting to take more hold in landscape architecture and beginning to take more hold in architecture, is this idea of kind of true design collaboration. It's something that we're really trying to collaborate with really unconventional partners, and it's something that's, I think, really expressed in this last project, and it's something we're now trying to actively address in more of our work. But the idea of starting a project by reaching out as opposed to starting a project by defining your domain, I think is something that is happening more within the world of landscape architecture, and something that I'm very excited to advance in my future career.
I jumped the gun. Were there others? There's one more.
So I guess in terms of bringing that back to the academic kind of environment, do you see, like, I guess, like, what the role of teachers and, like, students in facilitating kind of these collaborative academic environments that can, I guess, train you for the professional field and that kind of thing?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think studio culture is actually the model. I mean, we use the most like basic form of architectural collaboration as the model for our professional work, right? And our interaction with school teachers, or our interaction with community members, or our interaction with scientists in a lot of ways, right? Like I think the most like kind of classic divide is like how a designer approaches a problem and how an engineer approaches a problem, and that in a lot of our work, we're brought to these, we've done a number of kind of coastal protection studies and work, and we, as a design office, we kind of come to the table and we say, okay, like who else should we invite to the table and what conversations should we have, and are the questions that are being posed to us the right questions? And then I think the way a lot of engineers are trained is that you come to the table and you're like, okay, what are the design criteria? What are we doing? Here's the best way of achieving that. And so that's, I think, what is truly innovative and unique about design education, about the kind of studio charrette model, and what we try to do with our engineers, with our school teachers, with our marine biologists, is invite everyone to the table from the beginning and like start asking these kind of provocative questions. And that's kind of how you get projects like this. And it's also part of the challenge of projects like this. So we're trying to regulate and permit this project right now. And some of the major questions around this work is like, tell me the primary purpose and need. And our response is there's three. There's a three-part purpose and need, right? It's social, ecological, risk reduction. But that doesn't necessarily check the box of the Army Corps of Engineers, who are more responsive to a primary purpose and need being about physical risk reduction. So there's challenges embedded in that approach as well.
How thick and how wide would be, if you bring back the oyster, would you foresee would be the best plan?
Sorry, can you say that again?
How thick and how wide would the oysters be where they live? What's your plan? I mean, should they be a mile wide or 2 miles wide, the oysters to keep them?
Well, I think, the answer to that would be very different depending upon who you asked. From a kind of day one kind of construction perspective, we would try to restore oysters as a kind of living crust to the breakwater system. But really the goal of the Harbor School and the Billion Oyster Project is actually to think about creating a sustainable oyster population within New York Harbor. And that's something that the historic population of New York Harbor could filter the water of the harbor in like a matter of 2 days or some very compressed period of time. And if we thought about this proposal becoming a seed source for oysters around the harbor, becoming a spat source for oysters around the harbor, and having more surfaces in the harbor that oysters connect to, this could be a much more kind of catalytic project for oyster restoration. So the short answer is kind of within the footprint of the breakwater construction, but the larger answer is that it should have multiple scales of impact over time. That's the very optimistic scenario.
Okay, I think we'll end there. Thank you for sharing your work.
Thank you.